The idea for this panel came when I saw this letter on the inside of the program that I just gave you. It's a letter from Judy Jensen, Dr. Judy Jensen, who taught here in the 1960s. She was a phys ed teacher, and in her role as phys ed teacher, she was also coach of various teams. The fact that that was occurring not only at Otterbein, but across the nation is reflected in the quote on the front of the program, and that's the quote that starts our book, Women in Sports. Okay, so that's the sort of the background. That's why I thought about this panel. And originally on this panel, I contacted Bud Yoest, who was a coach, a men's coach, track, football, and just about every other sport. And then later, the athletic director at Otterbein for years and years and years. Okay, one of the pioneers, one of the builders of Otterbein sports for decades. Okay, and I contacted him, and then I also contacted these women, and we've come forward with this panel. So let me introduce them. So we have Bud Yoest, who was athletic director. I'll let him say more about himself, but coach and athletic director at Otterbein for decades. Next to him is Joanne Stichweh, who I knew in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as I was beginning to teach here at Otterbein as a wonderful visual artist, very talented artist, and a great teacher with a great reputation from the visual art department. She taught everything in the visual art department. And I just learned in the last 8 or 10 or 15 years that she was also an athlete at Otterbein. So in the 1960s, when she was a student, she played a variety of sports, at least softball, field hockey, and basketball. Okay. Next to her is Candice Canzoneri, who I have known ever since I have come to Otterbein in the 70s and 80s as a wonderful fiction writer. Talented, funny fiction writer. But I also got to know her as a neighbor and as somebody who would zoom by my front door on an early Saturday morning on her rollerblades. Okay? I said, well, who is that dish rolling by
I'm a dish!
Yes, well, I thought you with a hat on.
Yeah.
And you couldn't see the gray hair. You know,
Yeah.
so I'm 50, she's 51. Like, whoa, what a knockout going by on her. Okay? And then I realized, well, she's my neighbor Candy, who is as old as I am, and still a dish, both of us. Okay? And she not only does rollerblades, but she plays soccer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And right about then, also, she was appointed the women's varsity soccer coach at Otterbein. So she coached
Yeah.
soccer here for a couple of years before Brandon Coons came along.
The
All
dark
right?
years.
No. And next to Candy is someone that you should know by now, Connie Richardson, women's basketball coach for many years here, and also associate athletic director. Before her coaching career, she was an All-American, an All-Ohio high school player, Caldwell High School down in southeastern Ohio, and then later an All-American at Heidelberg, an assistant coach at Capital, and then varsity coach at Otterbein for years and years and years, and took us to the NCAA playoffs, 2 years ago. So that's our panel, and I will shut up now and let them talk to you about what I'm really interested in your learning is the big question of how, you can bring forward in your mind your youth, your how you grew up in sports, and contrast the way you grew up with what they're going to tell you. So that's the big picture, and I will let them talk. Why don't we start with Bud saying a little bit about himself and his experience with women's sports, and then we'll go to Joanne and Candy and Connie.
Well, I entered Otterbein in 1949, if you can think back that far. And then I came back in 1956 to coach, head coach in track and field and assistant coach in football. I was also the intramural director and taught classes in the major department for physical education, teacher education. Through the years here, the departments were separated. We had a men's department and a women's department. The women had their home in what we call the association building, is where now the Roush building is. It was a beautiful building that was built by students back in the 1800s, but they had to tear it down because of it was deteriorating. And the women had a small basketball floor up there, and they handled all their program right from that facility. We were in the, what is now the Battelle. That was the alumni gymnasium. That was built in 1929. And then when the Reich was built in 1974, we both departments moved out to the right. But the men being separated, I was fully involved with the men's program, didn't have anything to do with the women's program. Dr. Marilyn Day and Joanne Van Sant were the leaders in that department, and they handled all the sports for women and all the teaching for women. So I didn't very much get involved with women's sports until I was president of the High Athletic Conference. And prior to that time, I served on the NCAA Council when Title IX came in. And then in 1984, we brought the women's program into the High Athletic Conference. And so before that time, the women were mostly with the AIAW, and before that, they handled their program under the WAA, which was almost all the colleges and universities had that in the women's program. Women's sports pretty much started out with play days, where they'd have competition, and sometimes they'd even have competition that would be telegraphed over the electronic, and they'd have tournaments that way. So they stayed right on the campus and had volleyball games with other institutions that were pretty much local. And when we started talking about women's sports in the High Athletic Conference, we had to bring them in to try to figure out how that would work in terms of scheduling, in terms of the number of coaches and the number of contests, the recruiting, and all that kind of thing. And since that, I was involved with that. And at that particular time, I was fortunate enough to have a sabbatical leave. So I visited every school in the conference, and we talked about the different problems that we had to face in terms of incorporating the women into the High Athletic Conference. So you can look back and say that women's athletics in our conference started in about 1984 and has grown since. So my knowledge of the women's sports only lasted from 1984 to 1992 when I retired. And since that time, I've been fortunate enough to view what's going on. In fact, I went to a volleyball game last night, a lot of enthusiasm, and women's sports have grown tremendously since in the High Athletic Conference and in the country since Title IX.
Joanne?
Well, I think I'll just start with some random things and then get more to the point later as time goes on. Can you hear me okay without? Good. 1984. I came in 1963, so I was way before all of that. I thought I'd start with a couple of believe it or not things. I'm 70 years old.
I don't believe it.
Good, thank you. I hoped you'd say that. So I first came to Otterbein as a freshman 51 years ago. And so I guess I have a cave person's knowledge of sports back in the early 60s. I thought you might be interested to know that tuition was $1,600 a year. back then. And at the same time, Ohio State was $100 a quarter, so you could go to Ohio State for $300 for the whole year.
Oh, my goodness.
So having parents who sacrificed in order to have you go to a college which cost 5 times as much was a big sacrifice. I was awarded a 1-year full scholarship for $1,600, but the catch was you could only get $400 a year. You had to go all 4 years to get the full scholarship. At any rate, some other maybe believe it or not things, as he mentioned, there was a men's gym and a women's gym. The men's gym is now the Battelle Fine Arts Center. Excuse me. And the women's gym was this little tiny, beautiful building where Roush Hall is now. The basketball court was the size of a handkerchief. Very occasionally, when we played another team from another school, we were allowed to use the alumni gym, but not always, just sometimes. So there weren't any, really there couldn't be any spectators for the women's sports because they had to be pasted up against a wall 1 foot from where the court line was. The positions I played 3 intercollegiate sports all 4 years. The positions I played don't even exist anymore because basketball was 3 guards on one end and 3 forwards on the other end, and I was a guard. So I played 4 years and never scored a point because I was a guard. It was a good thing. I was a guard probably. In softball, I played a position called short field, which doesn't exist anymore. It took 10 to play. I mean, so the short field,
Cricket.
So you played, I had no arm, so I couldn't play the outfield, but I could catch fly balls. So the short fielder played in between the infield and the outfield and didn't have to throw nearly as far. So that position doesn't exist anymore. In field hockey, which is the best sport ever invented in the whole world, I brought a picture of our team from 51 years ago, and I think Dr. Gorman said he'd pass that around for you to see. In terms of field hockey, I sometimes go down to Ohio State to watch the field hockey games. It's not, I can't even recognize the game. It's so different. And our uniforms, as you'll see, are fashionable uniforms, which we also wore for basketball, had so much fabric in them. They were called tunics. And they had so much fabric in them, it's a wonder you didn't trip over yourself trying to play. Some other, maybe believe it or not, when I was a freshman 51 years ago, women had to be in at 7:30. I'm waiting for a reaction to that.
Wow.
7:30.
So you couldn't go to your night classes?
There weren't any night classes.
Oh, all right, okay.
There weren't any night classes.
Wow.
And the thinking was if you got the women safely into their dorms at 7:30, the men didn't need any rules, so you all didn't have any rules, just the women. Unfair to women athletes was that you couldn't get a meal there was no campus center either. In fact, the dining hall was in this building. You couldn't be served unless you were wearing a dress or a skirt. So we'd go to practice and get out at 5 minutes till 6, and the dining hall closed at 6. You had to run from way back on the practice fields over to your dorm, throw on a skirt and get to the meal, maybe, if it hadn't closed. At least it's amazing you anyway.
Yeah.
Well, how about there was one telephone per floor in the dorms, in the hallway? No cell phones, forget that, no phones in the rooms. So when you got a phone call from outside, a buzzer rang in your room and you went out to the hall and stood by the bathroom door and talked on the one telephone. Wow. I'll get to sports later on.
Wow.
I just thought it might be interesting for you to know some of the differences. No soccer, but we had field hockey, which was the best. I think Dr. Gorman mentioned when we first met, I was teaching everything in the art department. There were only 2.5 of us. I always thought I was the half person in the department, and I did not teach computer art. Can you guess why? No computers. No computers. So I taught here for 31 years, retired about five or 6 years ago. Talk more about sports later.
Well, my experience is a lot different from theirs because,
You're a lot younger, are you?
yes, I'm tons younger than they are. I'm just out of my teens now.
You're still a dish.
Yes, I'm still a dish. We didn't have sports. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and there were no sports for girls. And part of that was due to the race question. So they did, at least in Memphis. In other eastern Tennessee, they did have girls basketball. But when I was growing up, we had to play, we played intramural sports during our PE classes, and we played team sports through the Y. And I was on, similar to Joanne's, we played 6-a-side basketball where you played half court. By the time I got through high school, and mind you, there were no girls' sports. That's why I brought my letter jacket that I stole from my brother. And because I couldn't get one because they didn't have girls' sports. So I just stole Reggie's. No, I borrowed it, and I still have it. We played, by the time I got done with high school, we actually had a thing called a rover guard. And that's what I played. The rover guard, you could take like 3 dribbles. When you were playing on the guard forward side, and by the time I got done playing high school basketball through the Y, I was the rover guard, and you could actually, one person was designated that could go back and forth, and I had unlimited dribble. So I could go back and forth across the center court line, and that suited me just fine.
Yeah, the rover is described in this timeline.
Oh, okay.
It came in 1962.
Oh, okay.
And the verb that's used is snatch. The
I never heard
the rover guard could snatch the ball from the opponent.
I could do all kinds of dirty little things like that, and I availed myself of that opportunity. And I played rover guard. We played. This bespeaks the '60s. We played powder puff football against other schools. But it was intramurals. And then what you were left with, oh, by the way, my Y team, y'all are too young to probably remember this person, but this is my claim to fame. I played basketball with Sybil Shepherd.
Wow.
So, who was tall and willowy and beautiful and became a TV star and a movie star, and I became me. But a dish. Little did Sybil know. But mostly what I had to do was play what they called country club sports. I played tennis, I played golf, I did swimming, because there were no women's sports teams. It simply didn't exist. And racially, segregation in Memphis was such that they did not want white girls of my generation to even have the possibility that there might be, the schools were segregated, but they didn't even want us to have the possibility if we went to a state tournament or something like that, that we would have to play against African Americans. When I went to Ole Miss, when I went to college, same thing pertained. There were no women's sports in college, mind you. I was dating a guy on the men's tennis team, and I worked out with the men's tennis team, and that's the entirety of my sports. You could, the rest of it was in PE class, and you could take bait and fly casting and wonderful. I excelled at that. You stood in the gym with a fishing rod and you went whack,
Oh my
and they didn't have hooks. mind you. We didn't use hooks, but we brained each other regularly with the fly rods. And that was pretty much it until I came up to the north when I came to graduate school at Ohio State, and I started playing intramural soccer and I continued to play tennis with friends, but started playing intramural soccer at Ohio State, and it was the team that later became the varsity side at Ohio State. We lobbied for years. We played actually a Big Ten schedule. We played all the Big Ten schools, and we played anybody who would play us. We'd play Cincinnati, we'd play Wheaton, we'd play whoever would come and play us, or we would go to them. But we paid our own transportation. We paid for our own uniforms. We would have a volunteer coach. And I was fortunate to, I kind of picked up the game pretty quickly, and I had a friend from British Guiana who had grown up playing soccer, and Seton taught me a whole bunch of stuff. And I started studying the game, began coaching at Westerville North, and playing. I think at one time I was playing on 5 different soccer teams, traveling around and playing, and I was coaching Olympic development and doing work for the ODP and doing all kinds of stuff with soccer. And then I ended up coming here. I had met Marilyn Day, who was our athletic director at that time, and Dean Van, of course, and they knew I had taught some classes here, Sports in America. I taught one year, and just the occasional class at that time, and they were in need of a soccer coach, and I jumped in and took over. And as I said to Connie, those were the dark days when it was lucky if I could practice. Oh gosh. I used to steal people from the basketball team to fill out the side sometimes.
Right,
because
I remember when the trainer made the goalie. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. We press ganged the trainer into goal one day, just because we were lucky if we had 11 folks at one time.
And that was the 1990s, early 90s.
Yeah,
Early 90s?
yeah. And so that was. It was great. I mean, I loved coaching, but it was really hard to get a full complement of players, and it was hard because when you can only go 7v7, and then you show up and you're playing a full side. That was about the most I ever could go with in practice was 7v7. We just didn't have the numbers, and that it grew, thankfully, and Brandon's done a terrific job. So, yeah, that's my story.
And then you and Joanne played.
We played softball together in a rec league
Westerville?
here in Westerville. Yeah, I played a little bit of everything. I didn't play silly mid-off or whatever she was playing in cricket or whatever.
You were playing Rover and something.
I was playing rover. I was rover. I played a little shortstop. I played a little second base. And of course, I grew up playing sports, baseball, football, everything with my brother and his friends. And, I could play softball. That was fine. No problem there. And I played for many years on any number of rec teams. I only tried fast pitch once. I have to say, these were slow pitch leagues. I only tried fast pitch once, and it broke my ankle, so that ended that little experiment.
Wow.
Sliding into second, I did it wrong.
Connie?
I probably was on the cusp of the Title IX era. So I was the 80s kid. I had a little different twist because I grew up in a town of about 100 people. So there wasn't, I don't believe there were any girls my age, but there were boys there. So I grew up playing sports with boys from the time I was little to the time I graduated high school. I got into, basketball was my love, and I think it was just because it was easy for us. I actually played a little bit of tag football, because that's just what the boys did, and I would jump in and play with them. But I started playing basketball, and that was kind of became my vehicle for everything that I've done in life. We didn't have any organized girls' sports in middle school. My freshman year, I was excited because I thought, okay, I get to play on a girls' basketball team. And they condemned our gym. So somehow the boys still got to play, but the girls didn't get to. So by the time I was a sophomore, junior, and senior, at that point in time, we had a team, and actually was pretty good. That became kind of that road to get me into college, which I went to Heidelberg. I really had no ambitions of going to college because no one really talked about it where I grew up. And I could have played at a higher level, and visited those schools, but I was so intimidated because once again I was a naive, young female that I really didn't even talk much. I really didn't start talking until I was about a sophomore in college when I started gaining some confidence. It's hard to believe, but it's the truth. I really didn't say anything. But anyway, so some smaller schools started taking some interest in me, and Heidelberg happened to be the guy that kept coming to my games, and I'd be mad because I lost. I was very competitive. I'd just leave the gym. I'm like, I'm not talking to anybody. But he kept coming back and kept coming back, and I finally went to campus, and it was about 4 hours for me, and that was a huge distance because my family, we didn't have a whole lot. We had one car. When they took me, they dropped me off and said, see you later. Hope you get home at Christmas. And that was really, and the only way I could do that is if I would get a ride about halfway, and I would beg someone to come get me in Columbus. And that was because my roommate lived there, and my family could get there. But anyway, so that's kind of how I ended up at Heidelberg. I walked on that campus, and I went, this is where I fit. I also knew I would start and play. That kind of contributed to it a little bit. But I felt very comfortable. Heidelberg's not very big. It was my first experience, and you're going to laugh, at one-way streets. I'd never seen anything or driven on anything like that. And I jokingly, I'm going to say this, I refer to myself as a legit hillbilly. So when you grow up in a town with no lights, nothing, it's just, there's not a lot there. Is anybody from Southeastern Ohio? Does anybody know Cambridge and Marietta? I thought those were cities. Okay, if that gives you any indication of my mentality and just being very naive. So I had a wonderful career at Heidelberg, and that's the cusp of when 84, 85, that was my junior year of becoming a part of the Ohio Athletic Conference. So I was a part of when that became about. Probably the biggest rule change, and probably one of the best rules that's ever been changed in the game of basketball, was the small ball for females. Do we know why we have a smaller ball?
Smaller hands.
Smaller hands. Good. So that to me was one of the best decisions as far as rules that they've ever made, because it allowed the women to control the ball a little bit more. So there was less turnovers, et
So
cetera.
you were playing with the bigger ball?
I played with the bigger ball.
Wow.
So, and actually the first ball that we played, the manufacturer was a volleyball maker, and you talk about a piece of junk ball. I mean, it's and I still have one. I kept one, but it was Tachikari, but it was real light, and it really kind of had the texture of a volleyball.
Right, so it bounced a lot.
Yeah, it was terrible, absolutely terrible. So that to me was my two biggest changes, as far as, I shouldn't say changes, at college, was the rule changes that started to evolve for the female, and then the females are becoming a part of the High Athletic Conference. And that continued to be the growth of all sports. It just kind of started evolving at that point in time. I had no ambitions of being a basketball coach. I actually went to school for criminal justice.
Same thing.
I ended up as a basketball coach. Psychology does come in handy when you're dealing with females every day. But once again, the vehicle that got me to where I was basketball. I happened to be, how many of you guys are seniors? Anybody
No,
seniors?
these are all freshmen.
All freshmen. My senior year in college, and you're gonna go through this, I was in the gym about March and went, oh my God, what do I do now? And a guy just happened, I knew they had fired our coach, and he walks in and says, why don't you stay another year, get your student teaching, because I'd taken enough classes over here, get your student teaching and be a student coach. So that's kind of how that all evolved. I did teach middle school and high school for a year. I loved the teaching part of it. I could not stand, it wasn't competitive enough for me athletic-wise. And I coached everything. I coached softball, I coached basketball. I guess that's not everything. I guess I assisted with volleyball. And the competitive part wasn't enough for me. And I was afraid of getting stuck. I went back home and had taught, once again, small community. Not a bad thing, I just was afraid of getting stuck there. And next thing I know, I ended up at Capitol, and I know. I spent 3 years over there wearing purple. I no longer can stand the color. But anyway, so that evolves. I end up here. You know, actually I said the only other place I would like to be would be at Otterbein, and next thing I know, I'm at Otterbein. And I actually coached soccer for a year at Capitol.
Wow.
So, and I coached it like basketball. And you tell soccer people that, and they're appalled, because I say it's just like basketball, and they're very offended when I say that. So,
No, I think that's true.
I agree.
Dribble with your feet.
Well, no, and the other thing is that, you know, when you grew up playing that three-a-side thing, you had to learn to move without the damn ball. Is that not true?
So I come to Otterbein. I actually worked under Dr. Yoest for 1 year. So 1 year? I think it was 1 year. And I was a part of when the departments were two different departments. There were men and there were women. And I was under Dr. Day, and Dr. Tyler was there at that point in time. So they were just phenomenal women that I was learning from at that point. And then I had the group of guys over here that I also learned from as well. So I got to see that evolve into us being one department. I've got to see the department go from, I used to teach everything. And I look back now and I laugh and I'm like, how did I do what I did? Because I taught a lot of classes and I coached and I had family. I to this day, I still don't know how I did what I did. I guess it's just you do what you do to survive. But so I watched the department come together as one. We were under Dick Reynolds at that point in time, and then I watched us separate from academics to athletics, which is where we are now. So I've kind of seen a little bit of everything evolve. I've seen good, I've seen how some things should work better, what does work, what doesn't work. So from my standpoint, it's very exciting to see where we've come. You know, and once again I appreciate what these guys have gone, because they've gone from literally no recognition and probably fighting to get balls and uniforms to, we got it pretty good right now. It's very equitable in all of your sports, you know. And I do see a little bit of field hockey out there. I don't understand it, but I do see it out there. But where we've come, we've got 20 sports now. I mean, we've got everything that we need to be competitive. And,
Who played field hockey in high school? Allie, you played, right?
Yay.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I evolved and where I've gotten and how I've gotten there. So
Let me ask you a question that takes us in a little bit different way with shooting. In the timeline, there's this note that any ball that was not shot as a two-handed chest shot or set shot, I guess, was a 1-point goal, and the two-handed set shot was a 2-point goal. That's way back. So if you shot it over your head this way, or if you shot it with one hand, it was only 1 point. Whereas, okay, when did the two-handed set shot start going out, and the women develop the one-handed, you know, the jump shot like men throw? Was that part of the smaller ball? Was that a part of weightlifting? Was that a part of what?
I would say it's part of that smaller ball, but I also think prior to that it was just, you know, from my standpoint, I never knew any different. But I played with boys, so I learned from boys.
Mm-hmm. Learned the
you
one-handed shot.
Yeah. So I don't even know that I have the true answer to that. You know, it's
I would
emulating
know.
what you see would be my perception and who's doing the teaching.
Mhm.
You know, let me add too that when I played in college, it was in high school, there was no 3-point line. I've also seen that go from no 3-point line. We got that in the late 80s to it being different than the men's, to now it's the same as the men's. So there's been some different rule changes from that standpoint too. I think they've done some rules that are terrible as well. Sometimes I think people change rules just to make themselves feel better, but
You remember set shots versus jump shots?
No, I remember underhanded free throws. That's what
Is that right? Wow.
I shot when I played in high school. We shot free throws
Well,
underhand.
Rick Barry used to shoot
I
underhand
know
at Purdue,
sometimes
used
he
to
did
do
that.
free throws underhand.
But
I always did because I played in the backyard with my brother and I always did the one-handed jump shot. Set shots were what they taught you at the Y, but as my memory, there wasn't a difference in the points by the time I came along.
I don't remember that either.
Don't you think the shot clock,
Oh, yeah.
shot clock's another change. I'm trying to think
well,
what
the
happened.
women's game's so much faster now.
And that was the reason of putting the shot clock in, because it does speed up the game. And just recently, last year was the first year, it's kind of funny, if you would go to a high school game or you go to a men's game, they always had the backcourt violation, 10 seconds. Women never had that because our shot clock was at 30. So you would be sitting in the stands hearing people yelling, 10 seconds, 10 seconds. Well, there was none. But that has now changed as well, and it's the same as the men.
According to this timeline, the shot clock came in the 1970s, 71. That's
For
when-
men, it hasn't always been there for women.
Okay.
The end of the
other
four-corner
remarkable-
defense.
Let me point out this other remarkable player. In Iowa was the place where 6-on-6 basketball was reigned supreme all the way up to the 90s. But in 1969, Denise Long sets the Iowa high school career scoring record at 6,250 points. And she was drafted by the San Francisco Warriors. She never signed with them, but she was drafted by the San Francisco Warriors. That's the NBA team. This is not WNBA. This was a girl. She was about 5'11", and she was drafted by the pro NBA San Francisco Warriors. So that's what they thought of her.
Is she a rover?
She must have
No,
been.
she was a forward. She was a forward. She was a scorer. What kinds of questions do you have for these people? They're your mother's and your grandmother's age, so you've talked athletics with your parents. Were your parents as active in athletics? Did they talk about playing sports in college, in high school? Question. Alice.
What position did you play in field hockey?
I was extremely competitive in everything, pretty much. And I played right inner, so I could score a lot.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be anywhere else. I wanted to mention something we've all mentioned about the rover. Before that, people having to stay on one side of the court or the other. We haven't mentioned why.
Yes, why?
Why? I think that's important in your thinking about women in sports. Women weren't considered physically, have enough stamina physically to be able to endure running up and down the court at all. And I'm going to go one farther because I used to teach a course called Women Artists in history too. And a lot of things are the same. There were periods even up into the 19th century where women weren't thought physically capable and mentally capable of going to college. It was too much of a physical strain on a woman's brain. So,
Well,
so-
and I mean, in sports, if you were wearing a whalebone corset and 40 pounds of, 40 pounds of,
Yeah.
organza down there, of course you're not going to have much turn of speed.
On the other hand, I want to give English literature credit for my field hockey career.
How so?
I think I read altogether too many English boarding school novels where the girls were always playing field hockey, and I thought, by golly, I'm gonna go to college and learn how to play hockey, so. I have a little story about that. I never played hockey in my life. We didn't have it in high school, but those novels made me want to play it. And I came to Otterbein because of field hockey.
Really?
Yes, really. I already knew I was going to major in art. But, so you still have those visitation days and prospective student days. And so I came to one of those, and I didn't even go to the art department. I went to the women's physical education. And I had one question. I said, if I come to Otterbein, can I play field hockey? And they said, well, sure. And so that sealed it. So when I came, I met the coach, and I said, can I be on the field hockey team? Have you ever played field hockey? No. Have you ever seen a game? No. Do you know anything? No. She said, well, this was Judy Jensen.
Yeah.
She had a wry wit. I'd suggest that you take a class first. Well, I was very shy, but I wasn't shy about wanting to play hockey, so I found out when the first practice was that I showed up. And she said, well, I guess you're here, you might as well pick up a stick. I didn't even know how to pick up the stick. But it didn't really matter because we hardly had enough people to make a team anyway. They needed every body they could get. And
Can
so,
you tell the story of the woman on this list that you mentioned?
oh,
before,
yes,
older?
yes.
What's that?
It didn't seem so odd to me. I mentioned it to you, but because I taught here for so many years, and by the time I was retiring, we often had non-traditional age students in our classes, which made classes very rich, I thought. But when I was a freshman, so was Jean Chapman, who's on this list of
Right.
athletes from the good old days, the very old days. And Jean Chapman was 40 years old when the rest of us were 18.
Wow.
And of course, we thought, how can this old lady play sports? She was better than any of us at 18. And she went on, she had been recruited by Judy Jensen because she had seen her over the years playing what we call industrial ball, commercial ball. I played industrial ball too, down in southern Ohio. But so she suggested that Jean Chapman come to Otterbein and try college at age 40. And she did come and got a degree in education, went on to teach physical education at the middle school. But she was making electric coils at National Electric Coil in an assembly line all her life up to that point. But so to you all, having older people in class is probably not unusual, but it was really unusual to have a 40-year-old woman athlete.
Right. And as you said before, not that many women went to college in the 50s and 60s. So there were, across the country, there were leagues, adult leagues.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Sponsored by industrial
Companies.
teams, companies, and the AAU had tournaments for them year in and year out. There were teams that were sponsored by clothing stores, factories, whatnot, and they would play. So you had these wonderful athletes who were 18, 19, 20 years old
And-
playing in those leagues and then showing up in the Olympics. Never, not college athletes, but showing up in the Olympics as Olympic athletes in running and basketball and whatnot.
I know that when you first talked to me about this panel months ago, you mentioned something about it. I remember talking to you about something, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
And that is, if my parents were still living, they'd be 100 years old this year. And I credit my parents very much for my encouraging their two daughters to play sports, because my experience in high school and junior high, girls hated physical education. They just hated it. And so there were just very few of us who were excited about sports, and our parents encouraged us to play, and I'll say something more about that. But one of the things, when you got me thinking about this, I know I mentioned to you, I thought it was so odd. My parents grew up in the poorest part of southern Ohio, rural southern Ohio, Lawrence County, which I still think is, it's still one of the poorest Appalachian counties in Ohio. And my mother grew up on a subsistence farm. A subsistence farm is a farm where the family grows just enough for their own food and enough to try to sell. In my grandparents' case, it was pigs and tobacco. I know that's not very popular today, but lots of people in southern Ohio made their living selling tobacco. And so just enough to live on. It was unbelievably poor area, still is. But my mother, I brought a picture for you to pass around too, because not too long from now you won't know anybody who taught in a one-room schoolhouse. My mother taught at age 16 in a one-room schoolhouse, all 8 grades. But what this has to do with sports is that after that she went to college, got a degree in English literature and physical education. And then she taught in rural southern Ohio in high school. She was the literature teacher, and she also coached basketball, girls, basketball, softball, and track. Her high school had no indoor court. I couldn't find a picture to bring you today of the girls at the outdoor basketball court. When they played other schools, they had to go to the other schools because they had no court, just a dirt court. But I was so surprised because growing up, I heard about how important athletics were to both the boys and the girls in rural Ohio. They had lots of games, lots of interest. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in the biggest high school in Columbus, North High School. We didn't even play any other schools. And I thought, how different. Way back, so much interest in girls' sports, and then so little in my high school
You see that
experience.
in that movie about Iowa high school basketball. It's a rural high school thing.
Mhm.
In the cities, there's resistance, and I think some of it in the cities is still, it's racial. The cities in Iowa were very tense about women playing in front of boys, and also the races mixing in the crowds of a high school game. Yeah.
I wondered, is there anybody here who's heard of the Waterloo Wonders?
The Waterloo Wonders.
Waterloo Wonders. That was way southern Ohio, back in the 30s.
I've heard of that.
They were the state champions. You can watch them on the, whatever you call that thing, YouTube. They were so famous. My mother was coaching in high school at the same time the Waterloo Wonders were playing. And so if you enjoyed that women's basketball, you have to look about the documentary on the Waterloo Wonders.
Yeah, the Waterloo Wonders are boys.
Boys.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
rural,
That's the 1930s.
rural, 1930s, rural Ohio. Yeah.
Yeah, 15, 20 years before Bebo Francis.
Yes.
Uh,
Whom I've also heard of.
Yes, yes.
And they haven't.
What other kinds of questions you guys got?
Alex.
Did any, like, male athletes, like, not like make fun of you, but give you a hard time for being an athlete?
I'd say they ignored us. Or made fun of us.
Well, I mean,
You played with
yeah, I played with
Boys, yeah.
with boys, and I played with my brother and all his friends, and they better not make fun of me, or something bad would happen. But I think as long as you could keep up with them, and I mean, in my experience, and as long as you could take the trash talk, which, you know, is, I think, universal and eternal. You just gave it back as good as you got, and then you were fine. Nobody made fun of us, but then we didn't have organized, we didn't have organized leagues. And things that, like when the intramurals would be played, or when I was in college, when like different sororities would play each other and stuff like that, when we would play football or basketball or whatever we were playing, it was a real popular thing. The guys would all come out and cheer. So I didn't experience that, no.
We had a lot of the male athletes supported the females, but I think an athlete's an athlete and they just want to win.
Yeah.
So they pick the best person. I was always picked first, and so I never had any issues with that, and I was always kind of tough. So I didn't have many problems with it. But athletes will pick the best person. They want to win, and I never really experienced it. And I thought we had a lot of support. Once again, I think being in those small communities, you kind of talk about the same thing as, that's all we had. That's what brought the communities together. But we had guys that, I wouldn't call them cheerleaders, but they would come out and they would do chants and cheers and whatnot for us.
You know, where I got most of my grief was from other girls.
Other girls.
Other girls,
Mhm.
and you know, I mean,
Yeah, because you were breaking the.
because I wasn't doing the social thing. I wasn't doing the cotillion thing,
Mhm.
if you can imagine. Now, my mother, I have to say, my dad and you know my brother were big sports folks, and that's where I gravitated. But my mother wanted me to be a tap dancer, if you can imagine
So
that.
something physical. But,
Physical.
But not.
Yeah, and when I scrubbed out of tap dancing, she tried baton, and I just used it to hit my brother. So,
Weapon.
a weapon, you know, you don't want to hand me a weapon. That's why I could never play field hockey. Have something weaponless.
We had a period of time there where the women ran the track meets.
Mhm.
In other words, we didn't have enough men that were.
Competitors?
Pardon?
Not enough competitors?
Well, we didn't have enough men that, in the classes, track and field classes, that was part of their responsibility to come out and learn how to run a track meet.
Oh, I see.
And so we didn't have the numbers, and so I recruited a lot of the women. And we had classes for them, and then they came out and they ran all the field events.
Yeah, so they had to keep the score and measure the lengths and.
Yeah, they did all of that. Yeah. And when I was in college here, we had a number of women that were tremendous athletes. And we didn't have, you know, the camaraderie necessarily right to support each other in the sport necessarily, but we got along very well, and it was a lot of fun to you know, be together in terms of our social activities. The first dance was held on this campus when I was in school,
Hmm.
back in the 50s, early
Wow.
50s.
Wow.
And I paid $600 to go to Otterbein.
Huh.
I got a $150 scholarship if I maintained a 2.7 grade point average.
So yes, the Methodist Church was against drinking and dancing. not
Well,
just
of
drinking.
course, there was the United Brethren Church when I first started here. Then it became the Evangelical United Brethren, then it became the United Methodist. It was very strict.
So were you called tomboys?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
proud of it.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah, absolutely.
Other questions, you guys? Questions, yeah?
What would you like to see change in sports today for women?
Well, I mean, since tennis is one of my things, I think the equal prize money in professional tennis would be a good thing, and I think that I think we're really getting towards kind of an equal opportunity in terms of the women's sports being supported and being given the amount of money from they don't get the kind of money that football gets in most schools, but I think women's sports, because of Title IX, have changed radically. I mean, and so much better funded, and I don't really know, except I don't know what I'd say except just a little more support from people. If we could get, now women's basketball, say at Tennessee, was so well supported it outdrew the men's basketball team for many years, but in terms of actual spectators at most sporting events in most colleges, I think you see, unless there's a tournament situation involved, I think you see more spectators at the men's events. I'd like to see that flip.
In sports like football, where there's real specialization, so you can have something like a field goal kicker be a girl.
As we do.
Right,
Yeah.
girls are starting to come into those male teams, but do you see in the next 40 or 50 years men's soccer teams, women's soccer teams morphing into just a soccer team where we have, or a hockey team, all as we do, I guess we have an adult hockey team now, an adult.
Ice hockey,
club.
you mean?
Yes, we have an adult ice hockey club at Otterbein, and Catherine is the one female member on that team. Do you see the NHL in 40 or 50 years having 15 or 20 females, or the Boston Red Sox having shortstops who are females?
I think it would be an anomaly. I mean,
Yeah,
just in,
strength,
and even if even if you're built like Serena Williams, I mean, there's not that many of us out there that are, that,
Little men.
yeah. I mean, given that kind of, physical composition, I mean, unless everybody starts eating steroids, I don't much see it's gonna happen.
Do not have the male hormones yet.
Yeah.
Other questions, you guys?
Do you think women's sports are given them as much respect now as they should?
I think so. I think probably, kind of going back to your question is, what can be better for the sport is maybe the exposure, and I don't know if I want to use the appreciation. It's kind of if people would come and let me just use an example. I was recruiting a kid, and the dad asked me, I was appalled, asked me if it was like intramurals, and I was so. I was fired up, and I don't think I called the kid again, but once again, that's just it's the ignorance of not attending a Division III basketball. It's good basketball.
Right.
Right.
And I think maybe just that exposure, and support, and I think here at Otterbein, we do a pretty good job of supporting one another, at each other's events, but it would be really nice to see even more of that support. And that's nothing that you can force. It's anything as long as you win, people come to watch. But I think exposure and maybe just the appreciation sometimes, because an athlete puts in time regardless if you're male or female. Spending the time and the energies and the love of what they're doing. Did I answer your question? I go back to also, what does athletics give you? And I gotta assume there's several athletes in here, but what is athletics about? And I think everyone's kind of touched on it in some way, shape, or form. To me, there's two things that why we compete. One, it's competition because we want to compete, and quite frankly, you want to win. But the other huge element I think of that is the relationships that are formed, and they're lasting relationships. And to me, those are two components of what athletics is about. And that, to me, is what brings everybody together and why we do what we do.
Right. Yeah, you find most students on the campus not pledging a fraternity or a sorority. Well, I don't need a fraternity or a sorority. I have my team, and that team is a 12-month relationship now for most kids. How many of you, Eric, you might be competing in two different sports? Anyone here a two-sport athlete? Eric might be, you're just track, right? Anyone, Damaris, you're football and track? Okay. Yeah, and that is a rarity in this day and age. You specialize, even as a child, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, you're pushed toward playing baseball or soccer or whatever. Whereas one athlete pretty much went from, they dropped their ball glove and then they went on to the basketball court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that? As you see especially Connie, you as a coach, say, is that something that you regret in your current athletes now, that they're not playing different sports? Or
I like the multi-sport athlete. And I go back a little bit, when I grew up, as I played basketball, softball, volleyball, and I'm gonna throw this in, I was in the band. And I had some of my best memories in the band.
Yeah.
But you did everything, and that's that small community of, you had to or you didn't have success, because they're just, you go back to numbers a little bit, or you wouldn't have the bodies to compete. Nowadays, my daughter last year, I said, just your freshman year, try all three, because you're only gonna get to do that one time in your life. And I had her do basketball, volleyball, and softball. At this point in time now, I said, you've got to get that down, because let me backtrack. I like the multi-sport athlete because different sports have different types of kids. I also like it because it doesn't allow for the burnout. There's so much burnout with you kids nowadays because as coaches, and in particular the youth, there's so much emphasis and selfishness that you can only play one sport, or if you don't play soccer for me in the summertime, I'm not gonna play you at the high school level. And that's out there, and I completely disagree with it. You know, I think it's important muscular development for especially young kids. You know, be as round as you can possibly be. But I think it's hurt where we are. And I get it. I mean, it's just the times have changed, and you can play a sport year round. You know, when we were growing up, you played just when you were in
all
season.
year.
Yeah.
There wasn't all of the extra travel softballs, basketballs. You know, you guys got hockey now. And I was a hockey mom. Who's my hockey player? Where are you? I was a hockey mom. Oh my God. You know, it was 5 o'clock, get in the back of the truck and get dressed as we drive. It was nuts.
Your son was the hockey player?
My son was a hockey player.
Yeah,
so-
so he did not choose hockey in college, he was playing
Correct.
Division I football.
Correct. So he played, but I've allowed both, not to talk about family philosophies, but I've allowed those kids to play until they said they didn't want to play the other sports. He played hockey up until his sophomore year in high school, and then there was a girl actually on his team, and she got in a fisticuffs. It was one of the best times I saw at a hockey game, because I was always freezing, but I mean, they knocked them down, helmets off and gloves, and here we go. And I think she took care of that kid's business in that day at one time. But no, I like the multi-athlete. I think it's socially good for you. I think it's physically good for you. And quite frankly, particularly young kids, it allows not to have as much burnout.
One last question and then we'll go. Do you think Title IX and women's sports are taking away resources and money from men's sports?
No.
No. And I think where you're gonna find that argument is sometimes what happens at a Division I school to meet the demands of the Title IX is, everybody thinks that just because you have this, you have to have that. It became a number of things. So what they would do, they would eliminate the male sports to keep the female sports. And I think that's when that, to me, it's a misperception of what Title IX's about. To
I
me,
think it's
that's-
added money.
What's that?
I think it's added money
Yeah.
for the simple reason that in the beginning, there was only so much scholarship money, particularly in schools that had to make their money through gate receipts. And so a lot of the so-called minor sports, which I don't believe we should call them that, got cut out because the money had to be spent for the larger number and the more popular sports. But I think over time, since the mid-'80s, that budgets have increased because the government says that things have to be equal. Now, that doesn't mean that if you spend $1 million on football, that you have to spend $1 million on tennis. That's not the point. The point is that tennis ought to have the same opportunity to have their scholarships and to have their programs as football has. And that's the whole concept that came about from Title IX. And I think don't you think it's growing
Yeah.
better
Right.
Yeah.
now? Because as I see the women's sports compared to what they were in 1984, there's just no comparison whatsoever.
And none from the 60s.
The 60s was terrible for women.
How many games do you play in basketball in a season?
25.
25. We were lucky if we had 3 intercollegiate games a season, or any of the other sports that I played.
Well, we want to thank you
Amazing.
guys very, very, very much for